the 16, you don't see him there?
Hi, and welcome back to On the Job with PORAC. I'm Brian Marvel, president of PORAC. With me is PORAC Vice President Damon Kurtz. We took a 9-month hiatus, so what better way to kickstart the series again by having our legislative advocate Randy Perry on. Randy has 26 years of experience as a lobbyist with Aaron Read Associates, an additional 15 years as a manager and chief legislative advocate for PORAC. Yes, Randy at one point in time was PORAC staff. Randy has written and lobbied legislation ranging from labor and workers' compensation issues to local government funding and laws increasing penalties for crimes against the public. He has an extensive background with association grassroots programs and has worked or managed every aspect of an issue in candidate campaigns, and he himself was a candidate for Congress many distant years ago. Randy, it's an honor to have you on here.
Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
Well, let's get started. Obviously, we've had a pretty rough several years dealing with the legislators and the legislative body here in Sacramento when it came to legislation. A lot of reactionary legislation. I felt like this year we might see a little bit tempered down, but there were still some bills that are going to affect our profession, and we've jumped all over them. And we're going to talk about a few of them today just to update the membership on what's going on in Sacramento. Obviously, the defund stupidity is sort of waning, but there still is some folks out there pushing to really hamper our ability to keep our communities safe. So we'll go ahead and start off with one of the first bills that we had a lot of conversation about, and that's Assembly Bill 93. By Assemblymember Bryan. It's about consent searches on stops. The backstory on that is there's a real big push by the RIPA board to have peace officers not make traffic stops, basic traffic stops for pretty much anything. Obviously, this was a watered down bill in a sense, but the reality is they wanted to hamper our ability to make stops, and when you do make a stop, they wanted to dramatically reduce our ability to search a vehicle, and that's really what this bill's about. And maybe you can give us a little bit of an update on that, Randy.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I think, again, thank you for having me. I know this has been a crazy year, and the last 6 years have been crazy. This year alone, we're tracking and working nearly 300 bills for PORAC. PORAC Executive Committee and Board of Directors have taken active positions, which means that we lobby for or against a bill directly on 51 bills this year. And so far, with the legislature just finishing what we call the halfway point, where bills have to be out of their house of origin, which was last Friday was a deadline, and then any bills moving to the other house begin the process again of policy committees, et cetera. We have already stopped 23 bills, so there are some bad bills out there, but we jumped on them early and killed some bad ones. AB 93 was one of those when Assemblymember Isaac Bryan, who's a freshman, came in. I think he kind of made a commitment to serious police reform in his view. This is one of those bills. This bill was introduced and it banned all consent searches, that you could not ask someone, period, whether or not you could search their vehicle. If you want to search their vehicle or search their body, if you're walking on the street, you would have to stop them and then get a search warrant if you suspected something. He amended the bill down to probable cause. So if you had probable cause, could you then ask them for a consent? He also amended the bill that's made it mandatory that if you asked them for consent, you had to have proof of that consent, which included either written consent, video consent of some type, or an audio consent. We still actively oppose the bill. The bill came up last Friday. It was sitting on the floor for 6 weeks. Finally came up Friday. And we stopped the bill. It needed 41 votes and got 39 in the end. We debated outside the chambers of the assembly floor. He and I did in front of about 15 assembly members, went back and forth till he finally committed to PORAC that if the bill moved to the Senate, he would not move that bill until we had a deal. And we said okay, but made it very clear we were still adamantly opposed to the bill on the floor. I think that statement alone showed what happened to the bill, because they went back, lifted the call on the bill, and it never did get 41 and died.
Didn't he ultimately lower the standard to reasonable suspicion?
He did. Well, that was an offer.
All right.
That was
okay.
an offer to us,
All
but
right.
you know, I'll be honest with you. I think the thing that held sway was in front of everyone. We told everyone that this is the first time that he and I had spoken on the bill, and this bill had been in print for 4 or 5 months. This is the first time that he had ever spoken with PORAC about this bill, and and everybody was a bit dismayed by that. They were like, "Are you serious?" And they asked him straight up, and he says, "That's correct." He said, and this was the last bill, and they were ready to go home. They were supposed to leave at noon. This was 2 o'clock. The bill's still on call. They have no other business. They're literally sitting there while we're out for an hour. And when I put a phone call into you and our attorneys, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And you guys were giving me direction. I would go back, and they're all just sitting waiting for that. And I think in the end, people were not happy that we were trying to cut a deal on something so serious in the last 5 minutes of the legislative session. So they just said no.
Well, it's quite interesting the way that some of these, legislators are, where they just dig in and they refuse to even have conversations, which to me is counterintuitive to what your role is as a legislator. You're elected to come up here and you're trying to pass laws that are going to affect everybody in the state. And in at least my opinion, it's incumbent on you to meet with all parties involved, even ones you don't agree with, to hear what their perspectives are, because you're making decisions that are going to affect everybody.
Absolutely.
And for them to just refuse to speak to us because we're quote unquote law enforcement or whatever their personal feelings are, is, it's very closed-minded, and I think it does a disservice to the communities that they serve and to the entire state of California.
Well, I made a comment in front of all these legislators. I said, I find it interesting that you have now been here for a year and a half, and that you don't realize that all of the law enforcement reform, police reform, quote unquote, that has happened in California, and California leads the nation in police reform, that PORAC has been at the table every single time on anything that's been successful in moving, and that you chose not to meet with us on your bill. And that was kind of the final thing. They turned around, went in, and the bill died. So to your point, I think is a big mistake on his part.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when they go to the committees and they're running their bills through the legislature, they're always talking about, well, I'll meet with anybody, I'll meet with law enforcement, but the reality is they never really do.
Or if they do finally meet with us, it's just arms crossed.
Yeah,
and
check
there's only
the box.
just a few members who are actually like the most. Nearly all the members will always have an open door to PORAC because they respect you guys.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. I often say it, and you've heard me say it before, is that we argue over the how, not the what, most of the time, right? Sometimes the what is a non-starter, but what are you trying to accomplish with this bill? Let's talk about it, and maybe we can get you there. Maybe how you're going about it is our issue, and maybe there's a common ground we can find, and often we do. That's the way this works. It's the way it's supposed to work. But not having any kind of discourse is detrimental, in my opinion, to the whole process.
I agree. We'll see if he brings this bill back.
Absolutely. Well, moving on to the next one, and this has definitely been a hot button topic for all of us. I know Damon and I have gotten a lot of phone calls, a lot of questions on it, and that's Assembly Bill 742 by Assembly Member Jackson, and this is in regards to the prohibition of canines usage. I was shocked to see a bill like this, but part of me is like, am I really shocked? It almost seems like there's this drive to take away tools away from peace officers to successfully get resolution without having to use force. And a canine, having worked the streets in 10 years, and I'm sure every peace officer in California can talk about it when a canine has de-escalated a situation just by either being on the scene or the barking alone. And unfortunately, Assemblymember Jackson uses very inflammatory language in describing how we utilize those dogs, which in my 25 years in law enforcement, we don't use the dogs that way, the way that he describes it. And what really made me upset was when he was at the press conference and he said, the cops in California turned in their white sheets for badges. That's not somebody who wants to work with peace officers. That's not somebody who wants their community safe. And this bill showed exactly what type of individual he is in regards to taking tools away from us for keeping our community safe.
It's funny. Those that scream the loudest about racial bias seem to be the most biased people. They just don't recognize it, or they don't care. But the bias against law enforcement within some folks at the Capitol is just it's they don't even try to hide it anymore. And obviously, the salacious comments that he made really just serve no purpose in this process. And it's flawed legislation, and I think we showed that.
Yeah, this is an example, again, of where had Assemblymember Corey Jackson come to us and said, hey, it's my understanding that there's not a whole lot of training, mandatory training or uniform training throughout the state on the use of canines. Can we do something about it? Let's get together some of the canine handlers, some of the canine trainers, and let's talk about what we can do. And let's look at statistics. And seriously, we could have sat down on this bill and said, you're right, let's talk about good uniform training, statewide minimum standards like we did, with our previous bill. And let's, bring in the experts, the handlers and the trainers, and bring them in and talk about how often are they used, what are they used for, what are the best uses, what is one department perhaps is a different use of canines because they're, a small, very urban, Berkeley, for example, versus a rural area like Siskiyou County. They're all different.
Well, and the reality is there's not a one-size-fits-all for this state.
Right.
Our state is very diverse, and how things are applied, both, through tactics, are going to be different. I mean, if you're a deputy and you're, 35, 45 minutes from your nearest backup, the way you deploy a canine and the way you just tactically handle your job is different than when you're in the inner city and you have 5 or 6 officers at every call. It's just different, and you have to recognize that. It's in my experience, and probably Brian's also, our canines train a lot, and because you're dealing with an animal you can't just talk to them, right? You have to kind of train them and make sure that repetition is there. So they're very well trained. So it's like I said, it was flawed legislation from its inception.
Well, this legislation banned the use of them in arrests. So he was when there were a couple of people who met with him from law enforcement, because he was told by the chair of public safety that you have to meet with law enforcement, never reached out to us. But one or two of the other law enforcement lobbyists went in and met with him, and he said, look, I'll talk about the bill, but I'll never move off of that. The dog shall never be trained or shall never be used to bite. And what do you do with that, right? So anyway, the bill failed.
Yep.
This bill was not even brought up on the assembly floor, by the way, because at the last count I had, he only had 22 votes. He needed 41. So both Republicans and Democrats were saying, yeah, come on.
Very nice. Well, the next other big bill that we got a lot of questions on was the geofencing, the privacy in regards to search warrants. It's Assembly Bill 793 by Assemblywoman Bonta. I know we had a lot of amendment requests on that, and it sounded like this one also came down to the last minute on the floor, so I'll let you explain what happened there. But it definitely appears that Assemblymember Mia Bonta is willing to work with us in the Senate to make the amends. So we can continue to do what needs to be done, protecting our communities, but also having the ability for what she wants to do with making sure that we're not targeting people that are getting abortions or gender affirming care.
Yeah, she stated early on that that was the intent of the bill. The problem is she wrote the bill that so broad that it covered all reverse demands by law enforcement, all geofencing, et cetera. So early on, we went to their office and said, look, we probably don't have an issue with what you're trying to get at, if it's truly what you're trying to get at. But, you know, nothing happened. And again, here's a bill that moved all the way to the assembly floor. And then when she realized that she may be short on votes, because there was a lot of opposition from the district attorneys, they were kind of taking the lead on this, she sat down and started finally talking with us. And so the district attorneys gave her some amendments. We all agreed with those amendments. So if they took those amendments, we would all go neutral. It was too late to actually adopt amendments, so we asked her to stand up on the assembly floor when she brought the bill up and make the statement that I am adopting all of these amendments. Well, the problem wasn't with the assemblywoman. The problem was the DA's amendments. One of the other advocates caught some language in there that still was overly broad and would have affected us. So we went back to the DAs and said, hey, what about this? And the DA said, oh, oops, we messed up. So what they did is we're literally in the last hour on Friday and took it back to Mia Bonta, and she said, look, I think we may need some of that language for some other reason. I won't go into it. But let's discuss it. So she did stand up on the floor, and she said, I am willing to take amendments. We have one small issue left that we have not had time to discuss, but we will work through this to get law enforcement off this bill.
Yeah.
And so the bill moved off. And the women legislators really, really wanted this bill for the reasons you stated. So we had the moderate Democrat leadership, you know, Blanca Rubio and the others come out, Cotty Petrie Norris, and say, hey, if she says this, are you okay to, you know, we all go up and move the bill to the Senate, and then you continue. And everybody said, yeah.
Yeah, that's just another piece of legislation that, in my opinion, we continue to see. It's more fear-mongering than anything else. We do it with the immigration, and now it's with abortions and reproductive care. That it's something that local law enforcement doesn't focus on. It's not our jobs. Just like immigration, it's not our jobs. But there's this idea out there, and if we put it out there publicly, people think that's what we're doing, and it causes fear in the community that the police officers are actually, like, we're sitting outside the clinic trying to figure out who's going in there. It doesn't happen, hasn't happened, it's not going to happen. But we put legislation out there to put it in people's minds that they're somehow protecting the public from us, and it just, again, erodes trust in law enforcement, and it's part of that ongoing narrative. It may not be defunded anymore, but it's still there, you know, creating doubt and mistrust with your local law enforcement, and this isn't one of our jobs. So.
Well, hey, we're getting close to our time limits here, so we got a couple more bills to go over. Why don't we just briefly talk about Assembly Bill 807 by Assemblymember McCarty?
Yeah, Assemblymember McCarty introduced a bill and was signed by the governor that said when an unarmed person is killed by law enforcement that the AG and Department of Justice will come in and do an investigation on that. This bill, AB 807, was introduced to expand that to all deaths. The bill failed. The Attorney General's office even said, look, we don't have the bandwidth to do this. They are already taking heat for being so far behind on the previous just unarmed. And so they don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the budget, so they actually told McCarty that they did not want this bill to pass.
Yeah.
So Assemblymember McCarty stopped the measure. Well, we stopped it. He didn't have the votes.
I know they continue to put additional demands on the Attorney General's office to do things that it's never done before. California's facing a tremendous budget deficit, and I just don't see the governor providing the necessary resources to be able to continue to expand the investigative duties from the AG's office when they're already they're understaffed already in a variety of areas, and then now having to take on additional work. I think is foolish. Why don't we just finish up with the last one, and that was the traffic bill, SB 50 by Senator Bradford. And this, like I talked a little bit earlier when I opened up the show, is just trying to prevent us from making traffic stops. So where is that one at, and what are we doing?
So SB 50 moved to the Assembly last week. The bill was introduced because it was really based on RIPA data, on stop data that RIPA board collects. And also what they were doing is basing the language on Philadelphia, who had passed a no stop. And remember what this, for the listeners, this bill would as introduced, would have stopped law enforcement from making any what they called minor stops, taillight violations, vehicle registration issues, and they took the language right out of Philadelphia. There have been a couple of cities who have adopted similar policies, maybe not as broad or restrictive as this, but LA has a similar position, but they negotiated it. Our opposition wasn't just based on the fact that we should be able to stop folks. Our opposition was, look, this is another one of those issues that you talked about, Brian, where you can't paint the state with such a broad brush. This is an issue that should be up to local government, whether or not they want their officers to be stopping people or not, or in limited circumstances. And this is a bargainable issue. This is terms and conditions of employment. And in LA and currently right now in San Francisco, they are at the table bargaining a similar proposal like this. So San Francisco's doing it for their citizens. LA did it for their citizens. So this bill, our opposition has been, let the locals make the decision on this type of stuff. By the way, what I also remind them is what they're basing it on is one city in another state. No one in the country has passed a statewide measure limiting stops. One city in Philadelphia, LA has a very limited proposal. A couple of other cities have done something similar, but they're all cities.
Yeah, once again, we're going to pass a statewide bill that affects everyone based on, an issue that may be localized, and we're not looking at the broader impacts of that. It's kind of ridiculous, and the things that happen from a minor traffic stop when it comes from investigations and the solving of crimes and preventing victims it really would be a detriment to law enforcement and public safety.
And it's a bit frustrating when they have so many fentanyl bills. They have bills trying to go after ghost guns and illegal firearms, and the last 2 or 3 major fentanyl busts that have had big press conferences by the Attorney General and the federal government, where their joint task force, have been on stops. And then you go and talk about how many people you've stopped who have serious felony warrants, and on and on. I don't have to tell you guys.
Ted
Unabomber, right?
Ted Kaczynski was
the Golden State Killer.
The Golden State Killer. These are just minor traffic stops, and we end up catching the bad guy. To take that tool away from law enforcement is really putting the public at risk.
Right.
Yeah. So, well, thanks for that, Randy. I appreciate the update. Those were definitely some of the bills that we received a lot of calls on and concern. As you stated, PORAC's on 51 bills, 23 of them are dead. But in reality, we're actually working about 300 total bills through the legislature. So June 2nd had to leave the House of Origin. They're in the new House, so now we have to work on the bills that we're working on. And I believe they're back in committee right now. And this will go until December, right? Or November?
No, it ends. The session this year is a non-election year, so it goes 2 weeks longer. It ends in the middle of September.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a lot of work ahead of us. I appreciate everything that you do. I know Damon and I both tout you throughout the state. You're one of the best, if not the best, in the state of California when it comes to advocacy. And PORAC is we're blessed to have you working for us because it's a monumental task. It feels like we're pushing against a tidal wave a lot of time on these bills, but you said it best. You just got to take them one at a time. one at a time. Pull your hair out if you had to like sit there and recognize that all of these are happening at once. But if you just sort of focus at one and you work it and you just sort of check them off the list as you go through.
That's why we always talk about being engaged and involved at the local level as well. Relationships matter, and your ability also to talk to them from the local level helps us up here at the state level, helps Randy do his job, helps us do our job. It's a team effort, and we need everybody engaged.
Yep, I agree with you on that one, Damon. Thank you for joining us on this latest episode of On the Job with PORAC with legislative advocate Randy Perry. We hope you found this discussion informative and engaging. As we bring this episode to a close, we'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to all our PORAC members and the dedicated men and women in law enforcement across our nation. Your unwavering commitment to keeping our communities safe is truly commendable. Remember, safety is paramount, so please take care and remain vigilant out there. Be smart, make the right choices, and have fun. Till next time, stay connected with us. Keep up the great work. Together we can make a difference. Thank you. PORAC is California's largest law enforcement organization and the largest statewide association in the nation, representing over 77,000 public safety members since 1953. Our monthly podcasts, as well as past episodes, are available on PORAC.org, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, PORAC's YouTube channel, or where popular podcasts are downloaded. Be sure to follow us on all our social media platforms and tag us with your suggestions for future show topics. To learn more about our organization, visit us at PORAC.org. We are PORAC.